Okay, so this is part 2, and this is how to wire it all together. So we're going to start at the first part of our signal chain again, and starting with your inputs, so your microphones, your DI boxes, things like that. So we're going to start, so there's our kick drum mic, and everything uses XLR cable on your microphones or a mic cable, and they just plug into your snake. So I'm going kick drum into channel 1. And then just for demonstration purposes, I just skip some mics around. So I'll show you. We have that overhead up here, and that is that CAD condenser mic for overhead. And I usually would run 2, a left and a right, for either side of the drum kit. And so that plugs in down here, and the channel 3. And then 4 would be my second overhead, and then 5 would be my bass. And how that direct box works that we were talking about earlier is you have an input, a through, and then out. So your input is a 1/4 inch in, and then here's the other end. And so this would be coming out of the bass player's guitar. If he's got a more expensive bass amp, he might actually just have an XLR out on his head or his cab, and you could just plug a XLR cable out of that directly into your snake. But if the bass player does not, this is how you patch him into your snake. So this comes out of his actual instrument, out of his bass, and then you go into the input, and then the through is how the bass player gets their signal back to their amp. So they go instrument into the input, the through, this end goes back into their input on their amp. So that's how they get their signal, which is why it's called a through, because think of it, it literally just comes in here, it splits, one's going through, and then this one's going to the output. So on your output, you now have an XLR output, and then that goes into your snake head. So some DI boxes have some more functions. Some of them are active, some are passive. Passive means it doesn't require power. This is an active one, so it requires phantom power. Or this one, actually, you can put a 9-volt battery in and it can run off battery power. So you've got some other functions on here, like a ground lift. So sometimes with these you get a little bit of a buzz or a hum, and you can try flipping that ground lift button on here, and that should be able to get rid of it. If not, you might have some other problems going on with your power. But traditionally, that usually will fix the problem, is the ground lift on there. And then you also have a pad switch built in on this one, which you can kind of hardly see there. You can kind of see it. And basically what this does is it's an attenuation pad, and it will subtract 20 dB of the input source. Sometimes your instruments will put out a lot hotter signal, and that's what I was talking about. How you have different types of line level and instrument level and mic level signals, and they put out way too hot for your microphone channel. So if you don't have a pad function on your mixer, you can do it on your DI box to shrink that volume down, basically, so it's a smaller voltage that you can work with. Sometimes your mixers will just have a pad, which will work as well. So it just gives you options, if you don't have the functionality on your mixer to do that. Most more expensive mixers will have a pad on every channel, though. So different DI boxes and different price ranges will have different functions. Like I said, for as cheap as a DI box as this is, it actually works pretty well, and it has quite a bit of features on it that a more expensive one would have. So there's our microphones, and we'll move on to the wireless vocal mic, which you see sitting up here on the stand. Well, wireless is obviously wireless, so it has a receiver. So I usually try to keep the receiver as close to the stage as possible. That way it doesn't have a far range that it has to try to get to. So our receiver is over here for the Sennheiser, and my Shure is over here. And basically what I did with these, you can get the little rack ears that you can mount them into your rack, but I have 2 different types of mics just because I got a deal on both of these, which is why I don't have matching receivers. Both of these, I think we found them for almost a steal. We found one of them on Craigslist, another one on eBay, just people getting rid of gear. I believe we got the Sennheiser one for like $100. That's what you'll pay for a brand new like SM58 hardwired. We got this wireless for $100. Same as this Shure. This Shure is like the basic wireless one. It's an older model. They don't even make it anymore. And you usually can't touch a basic wireless for under $300. And I believe we got this one on eBay again for around $100. It was kind of a gamble as to whether or not it worked, but we got it and it worked perfectly fine. So it just shows you can buy some used gear and get some good stuff for pretty cheap. So basically their outputs come out the back of the amp rack. So I make what's called a pigtail, and these are just 2 little short jumper XLRs that come off of the back of those receivers, and you kind of see them up in there. The Shure is right there. There's the Sennheiser back in there. So their power is plugged up inside the rack, and then their outputs come down here, and I have 1 and 2. One is my Shure, 2 is a Sennheiser. So I just drop wherever my amp rack is, and I just run a cable to my snake. So you see the number 2 here, and this XLR comes off over here, and then that is going into our vocal channel over here at channel 8. So that's how you can patch in wireless. You just set your receiver wherever, and you run your XLR to your snake. So we'll follow the snake back around. So you go through your 50 feet of the line. This goes back to your front of house. Then here is how it hooks to your mixer. So you can see we have our 8 channels plugged in up top here. So coming out of our fantail end of our snake, channels 1 through 8, and these are our inputs. Now to get out of our mixer, this is where the connecting of gear gets kind of complicated for some people, where they get it wrong. Most people can get a microphone into an input. Some people try not to use the snake and they just run all their mic cables directly back to the mixer. I highly suggest buying a snake. It's worth it to keep your stuff organized, and then you're not running 8 to 12 to 20 to 30 mic cables back to your mixer. Spend a little bit of money and try to find a cheap used snake, or if you got the money, buy a brand new one, but a snake definitely helps. So from your output, we'll go to that next and how it hooks up to the rack gear. Okay, so here we go. We got the work trunk flipped around towards the light so you can see the back. So this is coming out of the back of our mixer, and here's where I'm going to try to explain a little bit more in depth of the process of hooking the gear in. So I have my main left rights, and every mixer will have a main output. It's going to have a left and a right. I've never really seen a mono mixer, so it's going to pretty much be a stereo mixer for anything basic that you're buying. It might not always be XLR. Sometimes it's 1/4 inch, and then you got to use a 1/4 inch plug to go into your rack gear. But most stuff will have an XLR if you spend a little bit of money on it. Like I said, this mixer we got used for $100, and it works. So it actually has XLR out on the main left and right, and then our 2 auxiliary channels use the 1/4 inch outputs. So the aux 1 and 2 is going to our monitor mix 1 and 2, and we'll explain more about the actual mixer functions and the third segment of the video here. So our main outputs come over here, and then this goes into our 31 band EQ. Okay, so you see on the 31 band EQ, which is this middle device here, you see where it says inputs. That is our main left and right coming out of our mixer. So your 31 band goes in the signal chain coming out of your mixer into your 31 band, and then out of your 31 band into your snake returns. This is the correct way of hooking in a 31 band to your main outputs. Some bigger consoles or mixers might actually have an insert point to where it'll say send and return, and sometimes you'll see people hooking a 31 band into the insert point. That would also be correct if your board has that functionality. You're looking at a way more expensive console. That's how monitors are mixed in the pro world, is they use insert points, and if you had that function you could use it too. But for your basic mixers, it's not going to have an insert point on your mains. So this is the correct way to hook it up. Just to be clear, I don't know what other variants people have tried, but I know people have probably done it wrong. So basically your 31 band is the first thing in your signal chain coming out of your mixer. So your main outputs hit this first, and this allows you to tune your main speakers to the room and how to cut out feedback and things like that when we go into how to actually use the 31 band EQ. And if you don't actually know what 31 band means, basically it means there are 31 bands of frequency, or a 1/3 octave EQ is another name for it, that you can cut. There are 31 individual bands that you can cut. So that's why it's called a 31 band EQ. So your outputs are on the bottom of this guy. This one actually has 1/4 inch and XLR, so it just gives you the adaptability depending on what you have. So I build a pigtail for everything again. So my main outputs actually end up coming out here. So you see my left and right are labeled. So the left side here is coming off the pigtail out of my gear, and then the left right on my snake are already labeled, so they plug right in and I don't have to keep track of what goes where. So next are the aux outputs. So you see down here 1 and 2 going to 1 and 2 on these blue ends here. This is going to my snake. So 1 and 2 comes off the aux ends of our board. So this is how you do your monitor outputs. If you have a more expensive console, you might have XLR. Aux ends 1, 2, 3, 4, however many you have. So I have 1 and 2 come out of your outputs of your aux send or your auxiliary send. And they go into the inputs of what I'm using is the feedback destroyer just to tune my monitors. If you have another 31 band, then you would go into that. You want to have some sort of EQ on your wedges if you can afford it. You can try to get away with running your monitors without any sort of EQ, but there's really nothing you can do as far as cutting out feedback and things like that. You really want to dial your monitors in. You need to be able to tune out those frequencies that are causing feedback. So you need something that can do it. As I said, this feedback destroyer I got dirt cheap. Eventually I will just buy another 31 band, but I believe I found this used on Craigslist once again for like 30 bucks. So I said, you know, why not? It has 12 bands that I can cut out, and it actually does a pretty decent job of cutting out feedback. So that's that with that, and then we go back down our signal chain back to our amp rack from our snake. So once again, you follow the 50-foot line back to our snake and to our outputs of our snake head. Okay, so outputting out of our snake to our amp rack. So we have signal coming back down our snake, and then we need to get it to our amps. So if you remember from my other video, if you've seen it, I recommend you watch that video as well. Kind of give you some other tips on some wiring stuff. I demonstrated this little cable, and this is what we call a cable hod, is the kind of industry term for this, and it's basically just taking all of your cables that go to one place and connecting them together every 1.5 feet or so, every foot, with electrical tape so they all stay together. So I have left and right labeled here, mix 1, and then here's my last one, mix 2. So these go into the 1/4 inch returns on the snake. So return just means it's that. It is returning from your mixer to your snake. So now we have signal coming back out of our 1/4 inch plugs, and then we need to get them into our amplifiers so they can go out to our speakers. So the other end of this cable is right here. And then so they all come up to these XLR plugs on the other end. So I have mix 2 goes into there. And then we've got mix 1 here. And over here, my left and right go into here. And it's kind of a general rule of thumb when you're doing all your patching, which is your process of hooking up all your cables, is called your patch, is to try to always go from an output to an input, and it just helps you keep things in line and together. So it's always handy to start at your stage in, from your output of your microphone to your input of your snake, and then your output of your snake into the mixer, out of the mixer into your rack gear, and so on back, you know, to your snake, and then into your amp. So you go output to input. It just keeps you in a nice streamlined process, so you don't have any things getting mixed up. Sometimes if you run, you hook up something, you go back and hook something else up, and then you go back and do something else. You can get stuff what they call cross-patched, and that's where you have an input going in somewhere wrong, or the wrong output goes somewhere. So if you do it output to input and do it one step at a time and finish that step, it just helps you keep more organized. I've seen some stagehands that kind of run around like a chicken with their head cut off, and then we get stuff cross-patched, and then you got to go back through doing your sound check and figure out what got plugged in wrong. So if you just do it one step at a time and finish that process before you move on to something else, it's a simple, keep it simple, stupid rule that you could do to keep everything organized so you won't have anything messed up and you get it right the first time. So we now have signal into our amplifier. So like I said, if you didn't have these rack panels in here, you would be taking your snake returns and going directly into your inputs on your amps, like my auxes are in here, and then the other ones are down here. So coming out of the outputs is where your signal has to go next to into your speaker. So this is your last patch in your signal chain. So as I said, mine actually are pre-wired I have different types of connectors on mine, so I made them all the same type. So I'll show you the different types of cables here in a second. So basically you see all this hard wiring down here and these guys up here. All this come up inside my rack and come to my left, right, and my sub outputs here. And then my monitors actually come to this plug down here. And so I have this one right here ready to go. So this is a Nutric NL8 plug, or a Nutric locking NL8. It is also a speak-on type connector is the name of it. This is an 8-pole connector. So basically I showed this in my other video as well, but you could run 8 individual wires inside this, which is what is in this. This is 14 gauge wire, and there are 8 connectors in here. And basically I just plug this one cable in, and then that drops to my monitors. So your monitors might just run directly out of your amps. If you don't build something like this, you know, this might be a little too complicated for the beginner. So your monitor would just hook into the back of your amp, whatever type of connector you have, and I'll go over that in a second. Okay, so as far as your speaker connection types, these are your 3 basic types. Lots of amplifiers might have this, which is your 1/4 inch, and some speakers will have a 1/4 inch. Most of them, if you get a little bit higher model, will use the speak-on, but some of them use 1/4 inch. And so this is a 1/4 inch, and if you can notice, this is quite a bit thicker than an instrument cable. This is the actual 1/4 inch speaker cable. This is 14 gauge wire, so it's a heavy duty wire meant to handle high power. You do not want to use a guitar cable or an instrument cable to power your speakers from your amps. I've also seen other people try to make this mistake of using those 1/4 inch outputs that we came out of over there on the Snake and trying to use those to go into their speakers. You do not want to do that. Of course, if you had a powered speaker, as in the amplifier is in the speaker itself, yes, you could come off of that plug out of the Snake directly into the speaker. But if you're using separate power amplifiers like we are in this situation, you don't run that into your speakers. It goes into your amp, and then your amp, you use a speaker 1/4 inch cable. And when you buy them, it'll actually say on the side, speaker cable and 14 gauge. So make sure when you're buying speaker cables, if you have a 1/4 inch type connector on your amp or your speaker, then buy a 1/4 inch speaker cable. So very common one you'll see also is what's called a binding post. This is actually called a banana plug. I don't know why they call it a banana plug, but that's just the name they give for it. And that's the little round ones you see on the back of the amp. This actually can plug directly into those holes. As you saw on mine, when I was back here, you actually have these little screw-on connectors, and the wire can actually screw into this, or that post can just plug directly into this, so it just makes it a little faster to do this. Mine is hardwired, so I actually have them screwed in because mine never come off because they actually go to a female speak-on plug. So I don't have to worry about that, but those binding posts can accept the banana plugs that just plug right in the end of these. There is a little hole here, so you might have that as an option to plug those in. And then your third option is your speak-on cable. This is a NL4 connector speak-on cable. Basically, this is like the industry standard professional grade connector you're going to see. These are turning and locking cables, so they won't come out, and they're pretty secure, and you won't mix this up with an instrument cable or something else. So you know this only goes to a speaker is what these are used for. If you buy like a powered speaker or a powered sub, it might have this same type of connector on it that is going to a powered Edison plug, like your 3-prong grounded plug. That is also the same type of connector, but the term they use for that is a power con cable. So this is speak on, and then there's power con. So you want to keep those separate and make sure you're not plugging power into your regular speaker. So only use those with a powered speaker, as if the amp is already in it, they will use a plug like that. Sometimes they also use what's called an IEC plug, which is like what your computer powers off of. All of your rat gear uses an IEC power cable. Some powered speakers will use those as well. So just pay attention to what you're doing and make sure you're not plugging power cables into your speakers, and you could blow them up if it's not meant to be a powered speaker. So, but if you use this type of cable, you're coming off your amp, it's pretty easy not to get things mixed up. So, and some proper terminology for this, there's a lot of people that think, oh well, it's called an NL4 plug or it's called an NL8 plug. That is partially correct. That is basically the model number. This is how XLR, there is actually 3-pin XLR, there's 5-pin XLR, 6-pin XLR that are used for different stuff, like some comm devices, and you can also have DMX cabling. It's still called an XLR plug. Speak-on is the type of connector, and then NL4, NL8 is the model of connector. So you have 4 poles in this, or 4 connection points, and that NL8 plug, that big fat one I showed you, has 8 connection points. So speak-on is still a correct term, and then the NL4, NL8 is just more descriptive as to what type of plug it is. It doesn't matter how many wires you have in here. This is 14-2 wire, so there's it's a 14 gauge wire with 2 wires in it. So it's one single pair of this. So you have a positive and a negative in this cable. The name of the connector doesn't change to NL2 because there's 2 wires. This is still a speak-on NL4 connector, but there's just 2 wires. So hopefully that kind of clears some things up for those of you that don't know all the different connection types. It can get confusing when trying to buy stuff on the internet and people tell you, oh, you need NL4. What's NL4? So hopefully that kind of cleared up the different types of connectors that you will commonly see on consumer grade gear. So next we'll hook our speakers up to our amps, and then I will show you the third part on how to tune the system. Okay, so we're on our last connection point now. You see how I have these 2 cables here. One is labeled top, one is labeled sub. This is another one of those quick things you can do to hook your gear up faster. It takes a long time to do this. This is a 50-foot set of lines, but you see here I did the same thing. I have 2 cables that are hotted together. So I have a top and a sub to both sides of my stage. I don't need to run an individual line to each one. I have 2 paired lines that are already together. So this is coming from my left side of my stage. So my sub can go to either one of these sub inputs. As I said, it doesn't matter with the sub because it is mono. So there's 2 outputs, but it's receiving the same signal to both of these. So I just plug one into one side. So this is my left side. And then I have my second set here. I have my sub and top. So this is coming off my right speaker. So my top goes in the right, and my sub goes into my sub. So there I have both of my mains hooked in, one going to the left, one going to the right, and I just drop one set of cable to each side, and I don't have to run 4 individual cables and get them all tangled up. It just makes your process go quicker setting up and quicker to tear down because I've got less cables to wrap when they're all hooked together. So next I'll show you the back of the speakers. So you see the back of the speakers here. And on the back, so these seismic audio speakers actually give you your speak-on and 1/4 inch plugs. So they give you the versatility of whatever type of connector you have. So sometimes the amplifier might only have a binding post output and you have speak-on here. So you can get any combination of these cables possible. You can get speak-on the 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch the binding post, and whatever. So just whatever speakers you get and whatever amplifier you get, you can find the cabling to do this, to hook your speakers in. So you can really use any combination you would like. I always go with speak-on all the way. I don't buy speakers that don't have speak-on because that's just the connector I like using. 1/4 inch are easier for those prongs to get bent and stuff. These are actually a plastic fitting, so they're actually a little more flexible. You would think that they'd be weaker, but they're not. These 1/4 inch ones will get bent way easier than this, and these are way more solid. They don't come out. And they make a good solid connection. Sometimes your 1/4 inch, you might have a speaker cutting in and out because that 1/4 inch isn't plugged in all the way and secure. This, you have that solid click whenever it goes in, you know it's connected and it doesn't go anywhere. So speak-on is always a better way to go if you can. And then my subs use the same type of jack on the back, as you can see here. And I have 1/4 inch and speak-on those. Just a plate that I bought when I did this, but I always use the speak-on. So getting into your power situation, this is what kind of confuses people a lot. Is that whole ohms rating, like I talked about the amplifier at its 4 ohm load, or you have an 8 ohm load or a 2 ohm load. So basically, you see all these are all have there's 4 plugs here, and these are all parallel together. And basically what that means is the input comes in on both of these speakers. Any one of these can be an input or an output. So you can daisy chain your speakers together, and daisy chaining is a term used for when you plug into one speaker and then you daisy chain to another speaker. So you can come into this and out of this one, or you can come into this one and out of the 1/4 inch, or whatever. All these are connected together inside this jack here. So you can plug into either one of these as an input or an output. So when you buy a speaker, it'll have a rating on it as to what its ohm rating is. So you can see the little label on this one says impedance 4 ohms. Now this is 2 15s in this cab, which is what gives it a 4 ohm load. If you buy a single 15 with a horn, most likely it'll be an 8 ohm speaker. So basically, when you hook 2 8 ohm speakers together, it drops, it goes down, it doesn't go up. So 2 8 ohms together doesn't make 16 ohm. 2 8 ohm speakers connected together, when you go into one and out through there, will give a 4 ohm load to your amplifier. Now, if I were to connect another speaker out of this one of this same size, I would have a 2 ohm load at the amplifier. Now, a lot of amps, unless they're a big Pro Series amp, are not really meant to run in 2 ohms, so you always want to check your specs with every piece of gear you buy to see what its rating is and match that. If it says it can't go to 2 ohm, then don't hook it up in 2 ohm, because you can fry out an amplifier. So just always pay attention to this when you're looking at it. 4 ohm rating on your speaker. You find the speaker you want. Okay, it takes 700 watts. You find an amplifier you want, and you go, okay, this amplifier puts out 700 watts RMS, then that's a good match. And make sure that's at 4 ohm. So if you have an 8 ohm, look at that rating. If you plan on running 2 speakers together, just make sure the amplifier can handle it. So it's just kind of quick advice. You can look up a lot of stuff, more information on ohms and stuff like that with your rating, but just kind of always try to match your power amp with your speakers. So you look at your stats, 700 watt RMS and 4 ohm impedance. It's always going to have a label on it. Read the stats and just try to match it up. Same thing with your subs. You hear a lot of people talking about bridging subs, and basically that is where you take the amplifier and it'll have a bridged mode, and it'll show on the back usually what it can do in bridge mode, and it'll give a wattage rating and a output for what it can do, and it's usually 4 ohms bridged. And basically what bridged means is it's taking channel 1 and 2 of your amplifier. So you see down here you have channel 1 and channel 2, or it might be A and B, and it's taking the power of both of those and combining it into one output to give it that max output together. So the 802 puts out 800 watts per channel. If this amp were to be bridged, and there's a little switch on the back that'll say bridged, that will then put out 1600 watts at 4 ohms out of that one plug. So if you had it, say you're running one subwoofer that can handle 1600 watts RMS, and it's a 4 ohm subwoofer, you could use that bridged output and put it in bridge mode, and then you'd be getting that max power at 1600 watts, that one sub. Mine, I have 2 4 ohm subs, so I run one off each channel because I would drop down to a 2 ohm load, and the 802 is not really meant to do that, and it puts out the same wattage anyways, so it really doesn't make a difference because it still puts out 800 per side, so I'm still getting 1600 watts total anyway. So it's always safer just to run them one speaker per channel if you don't know about ohm matching and rating, stuff like that. So, and then I talked about power earlier. So in looking at power, look at what the amp actually draws. Just because it says it's an 1800 watt amp, doesn't mean it's actually pulling 1800 watts from the plug. So it'll have a rating, read the manual, it'll say what it actually draws. It might only be 15 amps, it might only be 10 amps, because the transformers and stuff they put in the amplifiers can draw less power, and then it can actually boost power using the transformers that's inside of there. So always read the manuals and make sure that you're not overloading your circuit. Look at your current draw for all of your amplifiers and add them together, and make sure you're not going to be drawing more than your circuit is rated for. So that's basically everything on the connecting end of how to hook up all of your gear together and all your basic connector types. I will show you real quick some different types of signal cables, just so there's not any confusion on that one, getting different types of signal cables. And then we'll move on to part 3 with the system tuning and how to dial in your settings and how to operate basic mixer operation and things like that. So the last thing I'll show you for the part 2 is the different types of signal cables that you'll commonly see. And so to give you a brief overview, so you're not confused on what the difference between balanced and unbalanced and what all that means. So most of you that are musicians will recognize this cable. It's a 1/4 inch cable. This type of connector is actually called a tip sleeve connector. And if you look down here, real small, you see this little white ring, and this means that it is a tip, which is on this end, and this is the sleeve. So actually how this plug works is your hot or your positive connection is in the tip, and the cold is in the sleeve, which is this part right here. So that is your negative. So you have hot and negative. There's 2 lines inside of this, which unbalanced means it is a ungrounded cable or unbalanced cable. So whenever you take one of these apart, you will see only 2 wires in there going to the tip and the ring. So when you move on to your balanced cable, this is what you want to use when actually hooking up like your rack gear. So these are fine just going out of your instrument into your amplifiers and stuff, and into that DI box. Basically what the DI box does is it turns this type of cable into a balanced signal. So you see these, the balanced version of cables means it has a positive, a negative, and a ground, or a hot, a cold, and a ground. So you look at this, this is a 1/4 inch tip ring sleeve connector. So you see the tip up here, you have the ring, and then you have a sleeve. So this one goes hot, cold, and ground traditionally. There are different variants of wiring, and if you look up, you get a book on audio principles. One great book actually to get while I'm thinking of it is the Yamaha Live Sound Reinforcement Handbook. It's kind of dated, but it has all of your basic principles of audio, from acoustics to ohms to wattage to all those different types of industry terms, the dB voltage, the dB sound pressure levels. All of your industry terms are in there. It's a great book to get to just learn a lot of that audio jargon, so to say. It was actually a book used for one of my live sound classes for my degree. So they show some wiring diagrams in there. So this is actually an adapter cable from a 1/4 inch to an XLR. So like I said before, there's like mixers that have a 1/4 inch output. You want to use a balanced signal cable on those. And basically balance means it's grounded, so there's less chance of interference of getting your ground hum noise and your buzzing and stuff like that. And then of course your microphones are going to use this, which is a XLR type connector, or they're also sold as a mic cable. And this as well is a hot, cold, and a ground connector. So this is a braided cable. So inside of here you have 2 solid wires going to your hot and your cold, and your ground is a braided sleeve that wraps all the way around this. Under this insulation is a braided metal wire cable, and that actually is your ground, is the braid. So that cancels out all the external noise and interference and buzzing and hums you get like with your guitar cables. Your balance cables won't do that, because you definitely don't want buzzing and humming in your microphones. So this gives you clean signal for all of your rack gear. Your outputs, your inputs are all going to use a balanced cable So it's just important to understand what those different types of cables are for, because you don't want to be using an unbalanced connector like this on a balanced output. So if you look at all your gear, it'll usually have a label. Like I said, read the manuals on everything you have. It'll give you a better understanding of how the gear operates, and it will tell you this output is balanced, this output is unbalanced. So make sure you're using balanced cables with balanced connectors. So you want to use one of these guys for a balanced connector. And an XLR, of course, is self-explanatory. It's only going to plug into an XLR jack. But quarter inch, you can mix these up if you don't pay attention. So make sure you're getting the proper cables for whatever connectors your gear has. It's always best, if you can, to go with XLR. Like I said, the higher price point gear is always going to have XLR. Once you get up into more expensive consoles that'll hardly ever use anything quarter inch at all of its outputs will be pretty much XLR in your higher end gear. So like I said, buy what you can afford, buy the gear that you need to get the job done. You know, you just buy the quality and the price range that you want. You don't have to spend, you know, all the money in the world on your rig. Buy what price range you can buy in. So with that, we'll move on to part 3.